Welcome to Around the Writer's Table, a podcast focusing on the crossroads of creativity, craft, and conscious living for writers of all ages and backgrounds. Your hosts are Gina, Melody, and KimBoo, three close friends and women of a certain age who bring to the table their eclectic backgrounds and unique perspectives on the trials, tribulations, and the joys of writing. So pull up a chair and get comfortable here around the writer's table.
Welcome back, listeners, to Around the Writer's Table. This is your host, KimBoo York. And yes, that is host singular because today is one of our interview episodes, and I am interviewing one of my other hosts. I will be interviewing Melody, a scout who is actually here and will be introducing herself in a second. I have some great questions to ask her. And one of the reasons that we're doing this is because what we've done over 50 episodes. Can you believe that, Melody? Over 50 episodes.
Oh,
I
wow.
know. But
That's pretty
and we
amazing.
talk about our work all the time, but when we decided to do some interview episodes, I realized, we didn't really talk about ourselves too much. Like there's an introduction to us on the website and stuff, but I thought it would be great to actually sit down and talk to each other as good friends to share our experiences with our listeners in a more personal way. I've already interviewed Gina. That's a former episode, which I did not pull up the number, but it will be in the show notes if you want to go listen to that one. Today we are listening to Melody, and I, of course, am KimBoo York. I'm a professional author. I'm a productivity coach for authors. I write fiction, fantasy, romance, blah, blah, blah. I write a lot of nonfiction guides on how to write, especially focusing on discovery writing and serial writing. And I run the 1 Million Words Club, a membership community on Discord for writers who are looking to get the words out. So that's me. I'm going to let Melody do a brief introduction, and then we're going to go into our more long-winded interview part. So, Melody, give us a brief introduction for listeners who maybe don't know who you are yet.
Thanks, KimBoo. Welcome back, listeners. This is Melody, a scout. I'm a writer and author. I am a landscape designer and a plant spirit medicine healer. Basically, I love everything having to do with plants. I wrote a book called Soul of the Seasons, creating balance, harmony, and connection by tapping the wisdom of the natural world, and that is available at most online book retailers. So glad to be with you here.
I'm so glad. And we had originally scheduled this as a group session time. So we're on our usual schedule. It just feels like coming home again sometimes. Like here we are sitting around talking. It's been a year, and I know that things have changed for a lot of us, and that what we were doing a couple of years ago may not be what we're doing now, but I kind of want to get back to the source with you. And I first want to talk about Soul of the Seasons, which, if readers aren't familiar with it, you should be. It is less a sit down and read it from front to back book and more of an encyclopedia of knowledge about the seasons in plant spirit medicine. I learned a lot reading it. I still reference it on occasion when I have questions about life and issues that are going on with me. And while I know, and we'll get into a little bit maybe in your background about what drew you to plant spirit medicine, but there's a difference between practicing an art, a craft, a trade, a practice, a spiritual practice, any of those things, and then deciding to sit down and write a book about it. Like that's two different things. So, right? Like there's a lot of people,
Totally.
right? There's a lot of people who do things and just never write a book about it, but you did. What was the inspiration for you to sit down and try to collect that information and write that book? I knew it was a very long-term project for you. How'd that get started?
It absolutely was. Well, it's happened the way a lot of my passion projects get started. I got introduced to something. I read a book called Plant Spirit Medicine by Elliot Cohen, and it just struck a chord so deep in me. I said, I need to know more. And so I signed up for what I thought was going to be like a 1 week, overall program retreat about plant spirit medicine, and I realized after I got there, I had signed on for the 2-year healer training
That's the
course.
universe taking things out of your hands right there. That's like, oh
That's
no, what you
right.
thought you were going to do, that's not what you're going to do.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. And so, but after the first class, I had to go back. It struck something so deep in me.
Mm.
It was a system, a very ancient system of harmony and balance that explains so much by using the natural world as an example of it tells us so much about our inner cycles and seasons. And I thought, well, most of the books that I had for reference were academic books. I thought, well, let me just write up a little something
Uh-oh,
about this
famous last words.
2,300-year-old medicine that sages had studied and taught and perfected over the years, and that my beloved teacher Eliot had combined with 5-element medicine and plant spirit medicine together, married them together. So I had no idea what I was embarking on, but it struck a chord so deep because I felt anyone could benefit from it. It
Mm.
isn't, it's very spiritual based, but it isn't associated with any religion. It's just a way of tapping into wisdom that we all can benefit from. So yeah, it took me about 9.5, 10 years to get the book into print.
Woo, that's a lot of years.
Yeah, because I started it when I was still in the training course.
Mm, mm.
Yeah,
Was it more like a
yeah.
study guide for you? Like, oh, I'm going to write down this stuff so that I can, try to make sense of it type of thing? Or did you know you were going to share it from the start? I guess is what I'm asking.
When I started writing it, I knew, well, my intention was to share it because I was thinking, oh, people could really benefit from
Mm,
this, in all phases of their life.
hmm
Um, so yeah, I intended it and I thought, oh, I'll have it a short little booklet I can share with my friends.
mm, mm.
Well, so 104,000 words later.
Yeah, as I explained to readers earlier, this is a very intense book and it contains a lot of wisdom. In fact, the first 20 episodes of our podcast, give or take, again, there'll be links. We actually did seasons of writing where we used the Soul of the Seasons template that you have in the book to go through the seasons of the writing process. And we talked a lot about that. So I highly suggest if you're readers, pick up the book if you can. But if you're still curious a little bit more about what it is, go back and listen to those earlier episodes. Also, keep in mind their earlier episodes, we weren't quite as polished as we are now as podcasters, but we covered some great information in those episodes. And it's
Mm.
just a reflection of what so much is in the book. And that kind of leads me to my next question. I know that you were raised in a rural environment and your family was very much connected to the earth. There was gardening, there was hunting, there was, living in the wilds of nature, or at least engaging with it, which a lot of people have experience with and grown up in those environments. But what about it? At what point, at what age did you become conscious of or aware of your connection to plants, your interest outside of just like, oh, I'm going to go garden, like something a little bit more profound than that? Was that an early childhood interest or was that something you grew into as you moved through your adult years?
Well, I would say it's a little bit of both. Both my parents were, as you mentioned, lifelong gardeners. So they worked with plants on that level, but also, there was some knowledge about natural plants or wild plants and some as, maybe their medicinal uses. And so I was also taught the names of the wildflowers and plants that grew in the forest behind my home.
Mm,
And I just really, the forest felt like a safe place, a place I could play, a place I was connected to. But it really wasn't until in my 30s I had a spiritual awakening that realized, um, where I realized my profound connection to everything. And then with the plant spirit medicine training, it was, as you said, a template for how things work and fit together, the seasons and cycles of life. And it helped me understand this connection in a much more profound way.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I find that a lot of times these connections that we have as children that we aren't really conscious of, that we like feel at home in the forest for you. As we get older,
Mhm.
we start to make the connections. I guess our brain just starts wiring things together a little bit. And we're like, oh, that's why. Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very much so. But I mean, it's interesting too, like I said earlier, that as we have lived through the past 5 years, really, the COVID lockdowns, ongoing pandemic,
Mhm.
a lot of people are having health issues, a lot of people are dealing with things. It's creating a lot of change. Like, I remember when we had the lockdowns, suddenly people who had never cooked or baked before in their lives suddenly became, like, sourdough bread experts, right? Like, it's just like they picked up these things that
Yes.
they had never done before. Um and I'm not saying that that's the case with you because you are now working on a historical fiction novel. I know you've written some fiction in the past, but
Mhm.
this does seem to be a bit of a change for you as far as focus goes. So it was kind of a shadow of the question I asked about what inspired Soul of the Seasons, and uh, what is bringing you into writing this historical fiction novel, where before previously you were focusing more on nonfiction.
Well, to be honest, the nonfiction book was quite a surprise
Mm.
because when I first started writing, it was all fiction. It was, I have a weighty, unpublished novel that will never see the light of day,
I
but
think
it
we all
was a
have a few of
good.
those, yeah.
It was a good starting place
Mhm,
for me. I
mhm.
learned a lot about writing. I attended a local writers group and honed some of my skills. And I did not foresee having publishing nonfiction.
So nonfiction
Um,
was the outlier.
yeah,
Hmm.
and I wrote a number of short stories, and I just so inspired me and stimulated me. I mean, it fed a part of me
Mm.
that I didn't know I needed feeding.
Did you consider
And
yourself a writer
so
at that point, or were you just more of a dilettante type of?
it took me a time to actually say I am a writer to
Mm,
someone out loud.
really?
Yeah, I probably had been writing for maybe 6, 8 years already.
Wow.
Even had a few short stories published, but that seemed pretentious for me to claim that. But then I was like, nope, mm, I am a writer. I enjoy writing. I'm even kind of good at it. So I really claimed that. And then when the inspiration for Soul of the Seasons came along, it taught me to even hone my skills more deeply. Gina was my editor.
Mm,
I mean,
mhm.
if you're a regular listener, you'll know that. And she definitely helped me um, improve my writing skills.
Mm,
So when I get to the historical fiction, I also didn't intend to publish historical fiction. I had a story that was brewing in my head, and it was inspired by the female ancestors in my mother's side of the family.
mhm.
They were they all had some similarities, like they picked up and moved far distances away. Like my grandmother moved from Prussia in 1903 and settled in South Dakota. And
Wow, South
um,
Dakota. Like, you've talked about this novel
y-
before, but I never really put
yeah,
together that she was in South Dakota. Like, that is
yeah,
opposite side of the world, really. Wow.
exactly. And so, her mother was brave enough to do that. And then she did, and she moved again. And my mother did the same thing. She was born and raised in Washington and Oregon, and then decided to pick up and move to Wisconsin, where I grew up. And I became curious about how they made those shifts and changes, what motivated them to do that. And as I
Ooh.
started formulating the book, I realized what was going on in the world, the history of that time was just an integral part of what was happening. And I don't have a lot of actual documented information about my grandmother or even my mother for that matter.
Mhm.
So then I had to start researching and folding the historical aspects into the story of it. So it is a definite challenge
Mm.
because I want to be true to what was happening in history at that time. But I also like the fiction aspect of it where my characters then have a little more free range uh, to explore their relationships and what that was like to live during those
So
times.
what would you describe the theme of this book is? But, as like as far as individual character arcs.
I would say it's a story. The main character, of course, is a woman, and but overall, it is a story of women who overcome great odds, not only to survive, but to find who they are
Mm.
through that process, where their real strengths is. The main character starts out a little naive, very idealistic, very clear about her ideas of right and wrong, and then life happens
Mm.
and
Yes, it
tragedy
happens. Yeah.
happens.
Mhm.
Yeah, and she has to decide, what direction does she want to go? She finds a strength in her she didn't even think possible. And that kind of story has always inspired me
And I
and
see such
fascinated
metaphors
me.
there because you're talking about the inner journey, finding inner strength, deciding where she's going to go with her life, which, mirrors journeying from Prussia to South Dakota. Like that's a
Mhm.
huge journey that back in those days that required intense strength of will and determination. Like you just couldn't get on a hop a plane and go land somewhere else. So very interesting. I am like you've talked about this novel. I'm looking forward to reading it someday because it does sound absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank
You're
you.
so welcome. You're so welcome. So let's kind of circle back around. Do you find that writing Soul of the Seasons influences your fiction now? I mean, have you taken lessons from that you touched on that a little bit earlier, but I'd like to explore that a little bit. I think because I also write nonfiction, although mine are craft books for writers. And I
Mhm.
discover so much about my own process writing those books. And then I
Mhm.
come back to fiction, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I wrote about that in the book. Yeah, okay." So I'm kind of wondering if you're having a similar experience going through the process now of writing a much bigger project. Like, this isn't a short story, this is going to be a historical fiction novel and all that entails.
Yes, as a matter of fact, not only do I appreciate, the seasons of the writing process, which you talked about us having our earliest episodes were about, and undergoing those seasons and understanding my writing process better.
Mhm.
There's also the seasons of the internal arc of the character
Oh, okay.
and how does she move through those seasons. And from my understanding, having written a book about it, which includes a lot of the core emotions and how they play into how people react and respond in both balanced and unbalanced ways. It gives me some framework to work with a character on what is a plausible yet interesting sojourn, her transformation, her moving towards who and what she is, which is very different than what she had in the beginning before she immigrated to the US.
And we're both pantsers, discovery writers by nature, and, so now that you're talking about that character and her discovery, have you been surprised by your character? Has anything come up for you that you were like, "What? I wasn't what?"
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you don't have to share it if it's gonna be spoilery, but I was just curious, like, it's like, what how are you handling that?
Yeah, actually, several times. It's like, "What?" She did what? I thought at first, I love these stories, and you see them quite often, even in historical fiction, that, the women are independent and they have a strong mind and they make decisions. That's not the norm,
Right, right.
breaking cultural taboos and norms. But often you don't see the consequences
Mm. Mhm.
of making those decisions, which back in the day, there were a lot of consequences. Not that women didn't do that, but they also suffered
Right.
um, a lot of pushback and both culturally and sometimes physically.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so also women of that era, they lived in a man's world. They were not considered legally humans,
Mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
They had no rights of their own, and the character is going to be her husband passes, and how is she going to hang on to her property? Because it would not consider the woman to be the rightful heir of the property back in those days. It would be
Mm.
a male member of the family.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't really thought about that. So, it she's kinda stuck there in that male world. How rebellious can
Mhm.
she afford to be?
Yes.
Mm.
And so she has to work within her what's available to her at that time, which was not what we would do or even seen as appropriate to do
Mhm.
in this day and age. So, sort of
So you've had to, like,
steadying the
change a
man's
little bit
game.
of what you originally thought the story
Yeah.
was gonna be. Mm.
Yeah. I thought, she's going to be tough and outspoken. And like, yeah, that's not going to get her where she wants to go. That's
Yeah.
gonna
That's so true.
she'll be put outside next to the edge of the road.
Mhm.
She pushes that too hard.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
it's a delicate balance of moving towards what she wants while working within the confines of this very patriarchal, hard hard scrabble life.
Again, I'm looking forward to reading this book. This sounds absolutely fascinating. Okay, good.
Man, it's fun writing it. Gosh.
That's what I love is the joy of writing, That's it just means so much to me, and it's I think a lot of times we all talk about the technique and the writer's block and all these things, but when you get down to it, it's just darn fun, isn't it?
Oh my
Fun.
gosh, it is. And one of my favorite parts about writing the historical novel has been researching what actually happened and,
Uh-oh, the
finding
research
the
rabbit holes though.
oh my
Uh-oh.
gosh, yes, that could be, a vortex you can never crawl out of.
Ugh.
But, I mean, it was fascinating for me to look at the history and the plans of the ship that they traveled over on when
Mhm.
they immigrated, and what was the port like and what would it have been like to arrive at a new country where you didn't know the language or didn't know it well. So that part has just fascinated me, and it's been a blast, to be honest.
Yes, that's the whole point. So the next question I have for you is a little bit of a sensitive topic with a lot of people, but I think it's very important in the creative community, certainly coming after COVID, the ongoing pandemic, the lockdowns. A lot of people are dealing with health issues they never had before. I'm Gen X and we're getting older. I have a lot of friends who are suddenly like, oh no, my body doesn't work anymore. What's going on? But dealing with chronic health issues, and I know you've been dealing with chronic health issues for a while, how that affects you with fatigue, and brain fog. A lot of these issues are becoming more people are becoming more aware and more importantly talking about them publicly. So I want to kind
Mm.
of switch to that topic here as we wrap up. What challenges have you had with your health issues and your creativity, and what advice would you give people, especially people who are new to the chronic health, chronic illness life of, and are very frustrated with their inability to do the creative work that they used to be able to do?
Mm. I think this is really appropriate discussion for a lot of writers because um, more than a few of my friends have chronic immune issues.
Yeah, same.
And I, when I was finishing up my plant spirit medicine training and in the midst of writing the first draft, I came down with Lyme disease and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And for probably a good 6 to 8 months after I was bitten, I went through some pretty serious, not only fatigue, but brain fog
Mm,
and
ugh.
neurological stuff where it became hard to focus and bring words to mind, not only in speaking them, but putting them on paper. And then physically, I was so exhausted. I I had to pretty much do whatever I was gonna do before noon because by afternoon, I would be toast.
Mhm.
If I was lucky, if I was lucky to have a day where I did not wake up exhausted to begin with. So I turned to the plants and to plant spirit medicine to help me heal and recover as best I could. I was able to have a space to stay and a place to live for a while where I wasn't so worried about having to pay bills and I could recover during that time. It did not end there. After 6, 8 months, I felt a lot better. I moved back to Florida. And then 3 months after I got here, I had a rebound, which was actually worse than when I had it first time.
I hear that happens pretty regularly. I know several people who've been
Mm,
dealing with chronic illnesses where they go through the initial stage, they think they've hit bottom, start feeling better, and then they hadn't hit
mhm.
bottom. There's bottom is still left to hit. So,
Oh, yeah. And I was in a lot of pain this time. So I think it was beyond fibromyalgia. It felt like my shoulder was frozen.
mm,
I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't work on the computer. It hurt to sit up. The only time it didn't wasn't excruciating pain when I was laying in bed or when I was walking around weirdly. Not sure what that was about.
bodies are weird, man. Bodies are weird. Bodies.
Yes,
How did you
yes.
deal with the psychological frustration? Like, we're creative people, and not being able to
Mhm.
express that is excruciating, honestly. And I went through that a little bit when I had whooping cough, much less severe, but for a little while, yeah, I almost dropped out of graduate school because of it. So, how did you deal with that kind of anger and frustration over not being able to do the things that you wanted to do, especially creatively?
Yeah. Well, initially, to be honest, I was terrified.
Mm,
I know friends
reasonable.
who had Lyme disease, and they basically it was the end of their career and the life as they knew it because they could not function.
Mhm.
And hold a job that they normally would have done. I started reading a book by Stephen Booner called Healing Lyme, which was filled with a lot of fascinating information. He studied Lyme disease for 20 years and the plant medicines that helped with it. And I had to put it down because it just completely overwhelmed me
Mm.
with how insidious this disease is and how many people have it and don't know they have it, and how difficult and challenging the recovery is. And it wasn't until COVID hit, there's many similarities between long COVID and what people have experienced with that and the recovery of that and Lyme disease.
Interesting.
And so since it's gotten more visibility, more, research, a lot of Lyme disease patients were treated as if, it's all in your head sort of thing.
Hmm.
You don't have that, we gave you antibiotics, you don't have that in your body anymore. There should be no reason your tests look great,
Right.
no reason you
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
can't get out of bed, you know.
And people can't get out of bed.
So,
But you're
yeah,
right. I can see where that would be terrifying. Like that would probably overwhelm a lot of any creative urges, much less just regular, emotional landscape
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Well, just basic survival. How am I gonna earn a living if not too many jobs where you can say, "Okay, it's noon. I am so done for today. Going home. Gonna take a nap."
Ugh.
But I've been self-employed for a while, which allows me to mostly set my own schedule.
Mhm.
I really had to Lyme disease taught me so much about being in the present moment.
Mm.
Yeah. So, traditionally, culturally, historically, we are taught to push through our pain, push through our fatigue, keep going on. I'll rest when I'm dead, sort of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
thinking. And I was not able to do that. My body just would not allow it. If I did something, that was in excess of what I had energy or my body could tolerate, I immediately felt the effects of that. It's like, yeah, you're not going to sit down and rest. We're going to shut down and you won't have the option of getting up and pushing through it. So I had to become very present in the moment and listen to my body and honor it
Mm.
and quit before I reached the point of
That's
exhaustion.
hard.
Yeah.
As you
Yeah.
said, in our society, we're so taught like, "Oh, no, push through it, just keep going," and, it
Mhm.
sounds like, uh, I suppose it's a bit of a claim, is you must learn patience, Padawan. Like, it's patience,
Oh,
I
yeah,
guess,
it's
it
m
sounds like
more
it
im
was
and yeah, not only patience, but, learning to embrace and enjoy the season of rest.
Mm, yeah.
So the whole book, in my book Soul of the Seasons, there's a whole chapter. It's a season of winter, and that is about rest on all levels. We each have seasons where things come to a final end, a death, if you will.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily bad, but it means that it's the end and it's time to get quiet. It's time to go inward. It's time to conserve your energies. And like I said, I pretty much sucked at that uh, most of my life. And I didn't go willingly or joyfully into it, but I really had no other
Mm.
options. And now I do much better. I still push myself
Mhm.
on occasion, and I know I'm going to pay for it for a few days afterwards.
Your
But
comment here reminded me of something you told me a long time ago. I don't know if you remember telling me this, but we were talking because we live in winter. We don't really get autumn. Leaves do
mhm,
fall down sometimes. Like we get a little bit of
Mm,
foliage drift. But one of the things that you told me was that, and this was about winter and about that, the leaves have to die and have to fall off the tree because if they
mhm,
don't, then the tree won't be able to grow in the spring. It will be so
mhm.
encumbered with these old leaves and this old foliage, it won't be able to grow further. And that really hit home for me when you told me that because, I, like you said, you can't just push through and keep continual growth. That's cancer. Like that's what cancer does, right? It's
Mhm.
not a healthy thing,
Right,
right? So
right.
rest and being able to honor rest. It's not just falling asleep,
Mhm.
falling down when you can't go any further, but honoring rest. It's definitely something you've taught me a lot about, and especially in regards to the creative process.
Oh, well, thank you, and I I don't know how many times I had to prove it to myself that, I can push, 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 the quality of my work
Mhm.
suffers.
Yeah.
The more tired I am, the less I can my thinking is impaired.
Mhm.
If I will take that rest, whether it's a 20-minute nap or it's a weekend off or is it a media cleanse, um, my creativity comes back, my energy comes back, my inspiration comes back, and I get way more done than if I had just slogged through pushing every step of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, a hard lesson, but an important one. And I think a good one to end this interview on because we've already been talking for over 30 minutes, believe it or not. It's
Whoa.
I love talking with you. You are such a font of wisdom, and I really
Aw.
was happy that we could sit down and talk a little bit more in depth about the work that you're doing and the work that you've done. Like as I tell listeners, we did a whole series on writing the seasons, using Soul
Mhm.
of the Seasons as a guide through the writing process and internal journeys and external journeys. And so, highly recommend that, but also highly recommend the book. That's all the questions I got for you today, friend. Like, you got anything else you want to leave with?
Oh. Well, I appreciate you asking these insightful questions, and I hope I hope of our whole podcast is that we can inspire, encourage writers and other creative
Mhm.
types
Yeah.
to find a good rhythm that works for themselves. I don't know how many times we've said, "Just because somebody else said this is the way,
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's your way." And listening to your body and your heart and your own wisdom. And that keeps our creativity at its finest when we do that, along with the encouragement and support of our fellow writer friends and our beloveds.
And that's why I count myself lucky to have you for a friend and why I love doing the
Oh,
podcast with you.
likewise.
But this is KimBoo and Melody. We're signing off, and the next episode is going to be a group one. We're back to our threesome attempt to talk about stuff. I have no idea. We like sometimes we don't pick the topic ahead of time. I don't know what we're going to be talking about. I'm sure it'll be interesting, but it will be all three of us back again. And then we've got some more interviews coming up after that. So look for that, folks. Thank you for joining us here today. We
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks.
it.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us around the writer's table. Please feel free to suggest a topic or a guest by emailing info@aroundthewriterstable.com. Music provided with gracious permission by Langtree. A link to their music is on our homepage at aroundthewriterstable.com. Everyone here around the writer's table wishes you joy in your writing and everyday grace in your living. Take care until next time.